What if the person who saves you isn't the one who fights for you, but the one who doesn't flinch when the world calls you broken? What if your whole life you were treated like an object, and all it took to feel real again was someone looking at you without judgment? The auction dock of Midas 4 was a cacophony of flickering signs, engine whines, and desperate haggling. Merchants shouted over each other in every known language, and a few that weren't, promising buyers everything from refurbished hovercores to bonded labor contracts. Under the sulfur-colored sky of the outpost, nothing came for free, and everything came with strings. It was a place where things lost their names and gained price tags. Mason Wade walked through the maze of cargo stacks like a man searching for something he already expected not to find. He wasn't tall or intimidating. His jacket was patched, his boots scuffed, and his beard half-grown in defiance of any sort of presentation. What set him apart wasn't his looks. It was the way he moved. Quiet, steady, like someone who didn't need to prove he belonged. Because he didn't care if he did. He came for parts. Old converters, rusted clamps, maybe a control stabilizer if the price was wrong enough. He did not come for a child, and yet, just beyond a tarp fluttering in the chemical breeze, something caught his eye. It wasn't a sound, not movement, just stillness. Stillness that felt out of place in a world so loud. A crate sat half-covered beside the docking fence, the kind used for cargo too unstable for open transport. Its ID tag had long since been worn blank. A dent ran across its top edge, and one of the corner locks had failed, leaving a sliver of darkness within. From inside, two silver eyes watched the world without blinking. He paused. Other buyers passed without notice. A few glanced at the crate and moved on, faces tightening with practiced indifference. But Mason stepped closer. The girl inside was small. Alien, yes, but not grotesque. Just different. Skin pale blue with a green undertone, hair like ash brushed in silver. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, just watched. He crouched beside the crate. "How long have you been in there?" She didn't answer. He didn't expect her to. A merchant nearby noticed and sauntered over, already chewing a stim stick. "You interested in that thing?" Mason turned his head slowly. That thing got a name. The man shrugged. "Returned property. A couple of times, actually. Last buyer said she wouldn't speak, wouldn't work, wouldn't cry. Bit of a lemon if you ask me." "How much?" The merchant raised an eyebrow. "You serious I didn't stutter?" The man spat the stim stick onto the ground and scratched his neck. 200 credits. No haggle. Mason reached into his coat, pulled out a worn credit chip and pressed it into the reader. Done. The lock hissed as it disengaged. The crate door creaked open. The girl didn't move. She stared at him as if waiting for the catch, the trick, the condition. But he said nothing, just held out a hand. She looked at it for a long time. Then slowly, she stepped forward. Her feet touched the ground like she wasn't sure it would hold. She was barefoot, thin. Not dirty exactly, but dulled, as if the world had scraped away everything bright. Mason took off his jacket and placed it over her shoulders, not gently, not dramatically, just practically. "What's your name?" She didn't respond. "That's okay," he said. "You can borrow mine until you find it again." They walked away without fanfare. No one stopped them, no one looked. And in a place where everything had a price, Mason Wade bought something that didn't belong to anyone. Not really. She had no name, no papers, no past that anyone cared to keep, but he saw her, and he didn't look away. Have you ever tried to help someone who didn't trust help anymore? Who flinched not because they feared pain, but because they didn't believe in kindness? What does it take to earn trust when every good thing in their past came with a cost? The ride back was quiet. The ship wasn't anything special, just an old rust-colored hauler with a modified cargo bay and a cockpit that hummed unevenly when the lights flickered. Mason piloted with one hand on the throttle, the other resting on his knee, not looking back. The girl sat behind him, strapped into the co-pilot's seat, her small frame rigid like she was ready to be ejected at any moment. She said nothing. Her hands stayed folded on her lap. She blinked rarely, and when she did it was slow, like her body wasn't quite used to the rhythm of safety. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He just flew. They landed on Outpost Riven sometime near dusk. The air was dry there, filtered by old atmospheric converters that gave everything a faint metallic scent. Mason led her down a narrow walkway toward a domed shelter built into the cliffside. One door. No signage. Inside, it was warmer than it looked from the outside. The lights were soft. The floor was clean. Tools lined the walls in precise rows. Everything had a place. He motioned to the couch in the far corner. You can sit there if you want. She stood instead. Suit yourself. He walked into the adjoining room and returned a few minutes later with a plate. On it, 2 slices of rough brown bread. No butter, no filler, just bread. He set it on the table between them and walked away. Didn't push it, didn't offer it again, just let it be. The girl stared at it for a long time. Hours passed. He worked quietly in the corner, repairing a busted energy coil, humming a tune only he knew. She didn't move, didn't eat, until the room was silent again. He had left. The lights dimmed. Only then did she reach out, her hands trembling as she took a piece. She didn't bite right away. She held it close, smelled it, like it might vanish if she was too sudden. Then, cautiously, she ate. The next morning, Mason didn't mention it. He simply left another slice, then another the day after. By the 4th morning, he found the plate empty before she woke. Progress, he thought. He didn't smile, but he felt it. That week passed slowly. He repaired parts, taught repair droids new commands, filed invoices from clients who always paid late. She watched, sat near the doorway, never spoke, but she watched. On the 7th day, she picked up a rag and wiped the table after he finished dinner. He didn't comment, just handed her a wrench instead of a plate. She held it like it was something sacred. The next day, she turned a bolt without being asked. The day after that, she held a flashlight while he adjusted a coolant seal. He began leaving tools out, not because he needed them, but to see what she'd choose. Each time, she picked them up carefully, like the world was handing her tiny pieces of permission. And slowly, bit by bit, she started to breathe like someone who didn't expect every kindness to be followed by cruelty. One night, as a windstorm rattled the outpost walls, she stepped into the room while Mason rested on the couch. She didn't say anything. She just walked to the table and picked up the empty plate, then placed a fresh piece of bread on it and left it on the armrest beside him. When he opened his eyes later, he found it waiting there. He didn't eat it, but he didn't move it either. He let it stay. As if to say, I saw you and I understood. When was the last time someone called you by name and meant it? Not out of duty or habit, but with intention, with care. What does it do to a soul to go unnamed for so long that even the sound of kindness feels foreign? It had been nearly 2 weeks since Mason brought the girl back from Midas IV. She had yet to speak, not a whisper, not even a hum. But silence didn't mean stillness. Every day she moved a little more, stayed in the room a little longer, stood closer to the workbench. And Mason, for his part, kept showing up the same way he always had. Consistent, quiet, unbothered by the pace of her presence. On the 15th morning, he left a small box on the table, unmarked, wrapped in a strip of canvas, no ribbon, no note. She eyed it from the corner of the room for a full hour before stepping close. Inside, she found a piece of polymer, transparent, durable, shaped like a narrow card. Printed across the surface in clean black lettering was one word: Lyra. It wasn't loud, it wasn't framed in lights, but it shimmered with something she hadn't felt in years. Mason didn't explain. He didn't say, "This is yours," or "This is what I'll call you." He simply set it down and let her choose. Whether to accept, whether to claim, whether to believe it. That night, she didn't eat the bread. Instead, she took the card and placed it on her lap during dinner. He noticed, said nothing, but when he cleared the table, he left the plate with her name beside the sink. The next day, he called her by it. Lyra. She looked up so fast her head snapped slightly, like she wasn't sure she'd heard right. Mason met her eyes. "Can you hand me that spanner?" she did, without hesitation. As the days passed, the name settled into the space between them like music, slowly finding its melody. He used it sparingly, never forcing it, never testing it. But each time her posture changed, straight, calmer, less like someone waiting for the blow that never came. Lyra began sorting tools on her own. She memorized which shelves held which parts. She took to fixing the small drones, the ones Mason rarely used but kept around because they reminded him of quieter times. By the end of the third week, she asked her first question, barely a whisper. What does it mean he looked up from the drive core he was dismantling? What does what mean, my name? He paused. It was the name of a constellation. One you can't always see unless the sky's real clear. But when you do see it, it's impossible to miss. She held the card a little tighter. The next day, she scratched it into the bottom of one of the drones she fixed. The day after that, she etched it on the back of a piece of scrap metal and placed it by the front door. By the end of the month, she said it aloud to a client. "Hello, I'm Lyra." The client had nodded politely, unaware of the miracle that sentence represented. But Mason saw. That night, she found a new card on her bed. This one with a slight crack through the middle and an old serial number scratched off. Beside it was a note. Crew, she didn't sleep for a long time. Just lay there, staring at both names side by side. Not a possession, not a child, a person with a name. What happens when the past knocks on your door and demands you forget everything you've become? What if the world that once discarded you returns? Not to apologize, but to reclaim you as property. The sky over Outpost. Riven cracked with static on the morning it happened. A transport vessel docked 2 levels above Mason's workshop, sleek and polished in a way that didn't belong to a world like this. Its surface gleamed with corporate sigils, its landing struts hissing like predators exhaling. Mason was in the main hangar, recalibrating an energy buffer. Lyra was inside, sorting parts with the focus of someone who had only recently discovered she was allowed to take up space. The chime on the door rang without warning, followed by the heavy footsteps of someone who believed doors should open without permission. The man who entered wasn't tall, but he wore his authority like armor. Eyes sharp, movements rehearsed, voice trimmed down to only the syllables necessary to deliver orders. His name was Drex, and once, years ago, he had signed a ledger declaring Lyra a non-sentient asset. "I've come for my property," he said, eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. Mason stood slowly, wiped his hands on a cloth, took his time. "You lost something, maybe, but nothing here belongs to you. She was registered to my name. She's not an object. I have documentation. I have eyes. Look at her." Drex didn't. Not really. He glanced at Lyra the way one might check a number on a crate. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, but her hands tightened around the wrench she'd been holding. You can't keep her. She's not a citizen. She's not a person under outer code. Then, I guess you'll have to explain that to the arbiter. An hour later, they stood before the magistrate of Riven, an AI-bound neutral corps built to oversee trade disputes and maintain peace. The hearing chamber was cold, circular, lined with soft blue light and quiet static. Drex presented his case with smug precision. Purchase contracts, return orders, ownership transfers. His voice was devoid of emotion, his logic airtight. Lyra was property. She had been rejected, resold, and reclaimed. He had the right to retrieve her. Mason said little. Until the I requested a statement from the subject in question. Lyra stepped forward. Her voice shook, but she didn't step back. I was sold when I didn't speak. Returned when I didn't smile. Labeled defective because I was quiet, but I am not silent now. The room stilled. I am not owned. I choose to stay. Not because someone bought me, but because someone saw me. The arbiter processed the statement for 20 full seconds, then replied, subject. Exhibit self-identification autonomy. Reclassification to independent sentient entity confirmed. Claim of ownership nullified. Drex sputtered. You can't. You may leave the platform. The arbiter interrupted. You may not return. Mason didn't look at him as he stormed out. Lyra did, and for the first time, she did not feel smaller than the man who once kept her in a box. Outside the chamber, the wind blew softly. She stepped into the light without hesitation. And Mason, without a word, handed her a key. Can you truly belong somewhere if you were never asked to choose it? What if the first real power you're ever given is not over others, but simply over yourself? What does it mean when someone finally says the words no one else ever thought to say, you don't have to stay unless you want to? The walk back from the magistrate's chamber was quieter than the one that brought them there. No tension now, no looming threat. Just the hum of wind turbines in the distance and the soft, dry crunch of boots over sun-baked gravel. Mason didn't speak much. Lyra didn't need him to. But he did stop at the edge of the compound, where the archway framed the rust-orange horizon, and turned to face her. You don't owe me anything, she blinked. This place. This work. Me. None of it is something you're bound to. He held out the small brass key, the one to the side door of the garage, the one she used every morning. You can stay if you want, but only if you want. She took the key, didn't say a word, just held it, and nodded. From that day forward, something changed. Not between them, but around them. People who used to avert their gaze now nodded in greeting. Clients started asking if Lyra was available to assist. Some even brought gifts. A tool belt sized for her frame. A translator chip she didn't need but kept anyway. A hollow image of her standing beside Mason, printed by a young merchant boy who had asked for her to sign it. She still didn't speak often, but when she did, people listened. One afternoon, Mason returned from a run to find the workshop rearranged, not in chaos, in order, her order, tools labeled in 3 languages, inventory sorted by use, not by part type. A list of repairs written in tight, careful script pinned to the wall beside the door. He didn't say much, but he smiled. Lyra was beginning to own not just her place, but her purpose. She started tinkering with drone designs, sketching ideas into old ship manuals, fixing things Mason hadn't even noticed were broken. Once, she built a water recycler out of 4 scrapped vents and a filtration pipe. It worked better than the old one. But more than the machines, it was her stillness that changed. Not gone, but different. no longer the defensive curl of someone waiting to be caged again. It was the centered presence of someone who knew she wasn't leaving unless she chose to. She began carving again, something she hadn't done since the box. Wood, metal, clay, whatever was around. She sculpted a little figure first. A girl curled beside a workshop lamp, half asleep. Then another, standing with a wrench slung over her shoulder. One day, Mason found a new carving left beside his morning coffee. It was him, bent over a schematic, eyebrows furrowed, one hand reaching out with a tool. Underneath it, carved into the base in tiny letters, it said, "Thank you for the space to stay." He didn't ask what she meant. He just brewed a second cup and slid it across the table to her. She took it with both hands and drank slowly. Not because she was cold, but because something warm was building in the space between them. What makes someone a teacher? Is it knowledge, or is it the ability to offer quiet permission to try again when the world has told you you're not worth repairing? Can you teach healing without words? Just by showing up again and again without judgment, Lyra's hands had grown steady. Not just competent, but confident. She moved through the workshop like a mechanic born, not taught. And yet, it wasn't her skills that caught the attention of the outpost. It was her silence, the kind that didn't feel empty but patient. It filled the gaps others were too busy or too broken to notice. A merchant family from the outer rings brought their son one day. A boy with one arm and a dozen questions he didn't know how to ask. Mason offered to take a look at the damaged prosthetic. Lyra stepped forward instead. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't speak at all. She knelt in front of the boy and held out her hand. He hesitated, then gave her the arm. It sparked faintly at the elbow joint, a loose wire flickering like a heartbeat out of rhythm. She examined it gently, her touch never rushed. The boy watched her work, eyes wide. "You don't talk much, huh?" Lyra looked up, then, slowly, she shook her head. "That's okay, I don't either." The bond formed in that moment wasn't loud, it was built on shared quiet. After that, word spread. A girl who fixed not just machines, but something in the people who brought them. Clients came more often, but not for Mason, for her. They asked for Lyra. Mothers brought children with broken hover toys. Farmers brought failing irrigation consoles. A man from Sector 9 brought a drone he said had stopped working after his partner died. "I know it's silly," he muttered, "but she built it. I can't throw it away." Lyra didn't laugh. She simply fixed it and returned it without a word. He cried in the doorway, holding it like a memory that had somehow grown a pulse again. Mason watched it all. Didn't interfere, he knew better. He just made sure there was always tea ready when the clients left, and a place for Lyra to sit when the silence got too heavy. One evening, a small group of children gathered outside the workshop. Not because anything was broken, just to watch. Lyra stepped outside with a toolkit, sat on the ground, and opened it in front of them. She held up a part, waited. One child raised a hand. "Is that a capacitor?" She nodded. The next day, there were twice as many kids. By the end of the week, she had a dozen students, none enrolled, none assigned. But they came anyway. They brought broken watches, busted speakers, cracked tablet screens. She taught them how to unscrew without stripping the threads, how to hold wires without pinching, how to listen for the click that meant a circuit had caught again. No chalkboard, no tests, just tools and time. And someone who believed they could learn. Mason built a long workbench for them on the side wall, mounted lights above it, put out spare gloves. "You're building something," he said to her one night. She tilted her head. Not just machines, she didn't reply. But the next morning when he came in, he found a schematic pinned to the back wall. It wasn't a drone or an engine or a device. It was a diagram of hands. Big ones, small ones, calloused ones, trembling ones. And underneath, scrawled in her careful handwriting, all parts worth fixing. What does it take to act when everyone else freezes? Is courage something you find in your blood or in the silence you've lived with too long? Where does bravery come from when the people you love are the ones in danger? The storm rolled in without warning. On Outpost Riven, weather systems were mostly stable, regulated by old satellites and a few barely functioning cloud breakers. But that night, the wind screamed through the canyon like a wounded beast. Dust lashed against windows. Power flickered. And then came the crash. Not from the sky, from the docking yard. A supply freighter had lost stabilization during descent. Engines failed. It clipped the edge of the hangar tower and came down hard, fracturing the landing platform and collapsing a section of the outer corridor. Mason was already outside, assessing the damage, when the alarm sounded. Inside the collapsed corridor, someone was still trapped. One of the younger students, Sarah. The girl who'd come every day to sit near Lyra and ask questions with her eyes when her voice refused to come. Lyra stood frozen for a second. Then she moved. Not toward safety, but into the wreckage. She didn't yell, didn't hesitate. She pulled on a pair of gloves, grabbed a pry bar, and ran straight into the dust and firelight. Mason shouted after her, but the wind stole his voice. Inside the corridor, the metal groaned like it resented the pressure. Sparks danced from half-broken fixtures. Smoke curled from vents. But Lyra didn't flinch. She crawled through a shattered panel and found the child pinned beneath a support beam, crying but alive. Sarah's foot was trapped. Her eyes widened when she saw Lyra. "You came." Lyra nodded. Without a word, she wedged the bar beneath the beam. Her muscles strained. Her breath came in sharp bursts. Her hands slipped once, drawing blood. Still she pressed. Still she lifted. And the beam moved, just enough. Sarah pulled free. Lyra wrapped an arm around her and carried her out, one step at a time, lungs burning, vision swimming, but steps steady. When they emerged from the rubble, the crowd around the landing platform fell silent. No one moved. Then someone clapped, then another. Then the children ran forward. Mason reached them first. He took Sarah in one arm, Lyra in the other. Didn't say anything, didn't need to. Later that night, as the wind calmed and the lights were restored, someone placed a plaque on the wall of the workshop. A piece of polished steel, etched by hand. It read, "She fixed more than machines." She reminded us what hands were made for. Lyra didn't ask who had written it. She didn't need to. She sat at the workbench, bandaged and quiet, sipping a cup of tea Mason made without asking. He sat across from her, watched her trace the letters with one fingertip. She looked up, and for the first time in weeks she smiled. What is a name, if not a promise? A quiet declaration that says, "I am here, I matter, and I will not be forgotten." What does it mean when someone who was once labeled disposable becomes the reason others stand a little taller? The outpost returned to its rhythm in the days after the crash. Dust was cleared. Beams were replaced. The docking yard hummed back to life with the usual cargo runs and repair requests. But something had shifted. Not in the walls. In the people. They greeted each other differently, held doors a little longer, listened when others spoke, and at the center of it all was a girl with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had once forgotten how to hope. Lyra didn't want a statue. She didn't want songs. She wanted the workbench cleaned. The children showed up with flowers anyway. Scraps of metal shaped like stars. One even brought her a hand-drawn ID card that read, Captain Lyra with a scribbled badge below it. She kept them all, pinned to the wall above her tools. Mason watched without a word. But one evening, he handed her a small package. Inside, a piece of dark steel, smoothed at the edges. Engraved on it were 3 lines. Lyra, Crew. Not for sale. She held it for a long time. Then walked to the main gate of the outpost, where travelers passed through with dust still clinging to their boots. She mounted the plaque on the wall. High enough to be seen, low enough to be touched. That night, they sat outside under the stars. The wind was gentle, the kind that didn't push but carried. Mason looked up and pointed toward a thin constellation barely visible through the atmosphere. That one's Lyra. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Then, I guess it's home now. They didn't talk much after that, but they didn't need to. The next morning, she printed new badges for the students, not with grades, not with numbers, with names. Because names, she had learned, were anchors, not weights. She taught them how to build more than machines. She taught them how to build each other. And every time someone knocked on the door of the workshop, she answered. Not as property, not as a rescued thing, as Lyra. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who changed your life or helped you find your own name, tell us in the comments below. We read every one.